Um, Thank you so much for coming to Bard Graduate Center. My name is Andrew Kircher. I'm Director of Public Humanities and Research here. And can I start just by asking, how many of you are coming to Bard Graduate Center for the first time? You are a very special person. Thank you so much for coming tonight. And thank you to the rest of you for coming here again. I just want to reiterate what we are and why you're here. Bard Graduate Center is a research institute dedicated to the study of human history through objects, and we're situated right here on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And this land has a rich history. It is the ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape. We're also just down the block from Seneca Village, which was a 19th century community of Black landowners, which was destroyed in the creation of Central Park. But we come here daily, some of us, weekly, some of us, in pursuit of those sort of questions that only objects can answer. And that's done in many ways. Just down the block, we have an exhibition space, a gallery, which I hope you'll visit. It's open late tonight, and you can just run over there and let them know you were at the event, and they will welcome you with open arms. We have an exhibition called Sightlines on African Metal Arts, and it is truly an astounding exhibition. I really hope you make time for it. But also, we have an MA and PhD program here. We have fellowships. The MA and PhD program is stewarded and realized with a brilliant imagination by our faculty, many of whom are here tonight. Can I actually get you to raise your hands? Sorry, I know how embarrassing this is, but I just love to celebrate who we are as a community. Our research fellows are here tonight. Would you please raise your hands? We have publications, and we also have public humanities events such as this, which are moments where we want you to come and join us and be a part of the conversation. And tonight, we are so grateful because, and unfortunately, I'm standing in for my colleague, Catherine Whalen, who could not be here, but who had the brilliant idea of inviting MJ. So MJ Rymsza-Pawlowska is an associate professor of history at American Museum. She's the author of History Comes Alive, Public History and Popular Culture in the 1970s, numerous academic articles and pieces in the Washington Post and the Inclusive Historian's Handbook. MJ is a 2023 scholar in residence at the Heinrich Haus Museum and holds a fellowship at the Humanities Truck, and serves on the editorial board of Washington History, as well as advisory boards for the DC History Center and the University of Wrocław Public History Summer School. She's on the board of directors of Humanities DC and a series editor of the National Park Service and National Council on Public History's 2021-25 American Revolution 250th Commemoration Scholars Forum. She earned a doctorate in American Studies from Brown University and MA degrees from Brown in Public Humanities and Georgetown University in Communication, Culture, and Technology, and a BA in History from Barnard, right around here. So this is a bit of a homecoming. And tonight, we're so thrilled to have her at BGC. The work that she's sharing coming to Washington is part of a larger research project that will result in a monograph and other public-facing refractions. And this is something that's so important to BGC is thinking about all the different ways that we share research. And I feel like, MJ, you model how one question can reach the public in so many ways. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming MJ.
There it is. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? Awesome. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to share this work for you. It's a new project for me, as Andrew said, which is to say relatively new. I've been working on it for a few years, but this is one of the first times that I'm speaking on it. And I'm especially excited to be speaking on it in an audience that's outside of DC, because in some ways, the people that I really want to talk to are people who come to Washington. So because of the work that you do here at the Grad Center, and also since it's still very much a work in progress, I'll be focusing more on methodology. So I'm going to use some of the archival evidence, the cultural artifacts, the material culture that I'm working with to try to give you an overview of my process. So again, still in the middle of things, but I also always think it's more interesting for the audience and more generative for a scholar to present work that's kind of still in the process of iteration. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts at the end of this talk. So before we start, I want to do a very quick survey. So who here has visited Washington, D.C.? Okay, cool. All right, now, in what capacity? As a tourist. Okay, cool. As an activist. So a few people, yeah, good. How about as a political office holder, and this includes internships? This is my students at American University. Like all of them do internships on the Hill. So whenever I talk to them about this, they're like, me, multiple internships. Um, but these types of visitors are the kinds of visitors that I've become interested in through my research. I think that tourists, activists, and political office holders, and that means both elected and appointed officials. I think that individually together, they're fairly unique to DC. I also think that even though these are very much distinct categories, they borrow and overlap in really interesting ways. And it's these moments, the moments of overlap, and I'll talk a lot more about this, that can tell us a lot about what sort of assumptions inform how folks interact with Washington. So to start off, and this is largely redundant, but I'll give you a little bit of background about this project and about myself. So I live in Washington, D.C., where I teach in the history department and in the public history program at American University. I also grew up in DC. I was born in Poland, but we moved here or there when I was really young. So I really consider myself a Washingtonian. So if you spend any time living in DC, you develop, and this might be true for New York too, although in a different way, you develop a really keen awareness of tourists and school groups. So visitors have kind of always been on my mind in one way or another. But newcomers to DC and the city in general are also really, really well represented in popular culture. So movies like Legally Blonde 2 or Wonder Woman or all these TV shows like The West Wing or Scandal, or most recently Red, White, and Royal Blue, a film that I have not watched yet but will be watching soon for research. So these are all these ones that I threw up here are contemporary or fairly contemporary examples, but actually this has always been the case. We can trace it through National Lampoon's Senior Trip back to Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and then books like Mark Twain's The Gilded Age, which doesn't have as interesting of a cover, so I didn't put it on this slide, but I will talk about a little bit later. So thinking about all of this, and actually one of the early things that I did in this project is I made a list of every time DC shows up in popular culture, which is a giant, incredibly long list, is where I started to get my research question. So on one hand, we have all these people coming to DC, and on the other hand, we have all this representation of people coming to DC, but we don't have a sense of how these two go together. So in my public facing work, when Andrew read off my bio, I think you got the sense that I partner with a lot of organizations in DC in various capacities. We always do this research because we take public seriously. We're always interested in the kinds of ideas that visitors have about the city. We don't assume that our visitors are blank slates. We assume that they are complex people that we have to figure out how to engage with in various ways, public humanities, right? So I was already kind of doing this in various ways. I was mulling it over, but the thing that gave it a lot of urgency was January 6th. So I apologize for these Getty images. I'm cheap and I'm not going to pay for these until someone gives me money to do it. Watching footage when I was, watching this happen during and after, I noticed the thing that was, a lot of things were striking to me, obviously, but one of the things that really struck me is the degree to which the insurrectionists were acting like tourists. So they were stopping to take photographs. They were taking souvenirs. And this is the one on the bottom. This blows my mind. You break into the Capitol and you stay inside the velvet ropes. Like they're just ways in which they were once they got into the Capitol, they were enacting behavior that seemed to overlap with other categories. The other significant thing that I noticed that immediately, as soon as people started talking about this, one of the main defense was like, oh, well, they didn't know they couldn't go inside. They're Americans. They had every right to go inside. Isn't the Capitol theirs? Which, I thought that was something worth paying attention to. So these together made me think about a lot of things, right? On one hand, that actions in Washington are informed by specific assumptions, that these are closely connected to ideas about citizenship and participation on one hand, and a tradition of protest on the other. And then secondly, it seemed to me that the insurrectionists were enacting a kind of repertoire of behavior that they had built through other forms of visitation. So I saw a lot of you when you raised your hands. You raised your hands multiple times for different categories. So I think this is the case too. Like these are all people who maybe had been to DC before in various ways, or at least had a sense of knowing what to do. So as I read and researched more, I also realized how central visitors and newcomers have become to the governance of DC. That is because we do not have representation. You've probably seen a lot about this in the news recently. And also the nation, right? There seems to be a connection between how DC is governed and how the nation is governed, and also the same people. So as the more and more I started thinking about this, my implications got bigger and bigger. I'm not going to talk about this part, but I'm also happy to go into it in the Q&A. I think that there's something about the way that people who are not newcomers to DC sort of take up ideas about how it should be run. That's kind of unique to the city, and again connected to all of this as well. So here comes the beginning of the methods part. After a bit of reading, I decided to widen. So I had already been thinking about contemporary visitation, but I decided to widen my project to more about the history of visits to DC. Again, both real and fictional from the very beginning. So Washington was founded in 1800 as the nation's capital. It was brought into existence as the nation's capital in legislation. I'll talk to you about that in a second. So along with being a public historian, I'm a cultural historian, which is to say that I work comparatively with cultural artifacts and texts in different mediums and genres. And I'm also interested how shifts in culture reflect and help constitute changes at other registers. So this is going to tell you a little bit about how I decided to start answering some of these questions. So this is kind of the work I'm going to model for you today, but what I'm hoping to give you a sense of is how I'm tracing visitor expectations over time and across representations and experience. It's a giant question. As you can imagine, the archive for this is huge. So part of the work that I have to do has to do with selection and juxtaposition. And even though I'm aware I can't get to everything, I think I've been able to find significant patterns in the history of visitation of DC, which I'll talk to you a little bit more about. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time walking you through some of the sources that I have been working from, and each have their own challenges. So I'll speak a little bit about that as well. This is also a timeline of sorts. While it's true that many kinds of sources are present for the duration of my inquiry, I've come to find that individual genres and mediums flare up at particular moments. So for each epoch, there seems to be a type of source or a group of sources that seem to me to be more significant, not only because they're more popular or prevalent in wider popular culture, but also because they might have something more important to say. So I will try to give you a sense of that as well. So we're doing a timeline. The earlier part of this talk will have more background in history because I think it's possibly or probably not as well known. This might also be my bias as a 20th century historian. So I want to start by telling you briefly about what was in DC before DC. Nacotchtank Indians were living along the Potomac and the Chesapeake. So here's the Potomac River. We know a little bit about this from the records of encounters by the colonists, and this is a map from 1792. So this is Washington in the moment of formation. Before this, we know about sort of exploration by colonists John Smith and Henry Fleet in the 17th century. Colonists settled in Maryland and Virginia. They encroached on Nacotchtank land and trading posts along the river. And then they eventually brought infectious diseases that eventually killed the tribe. The very few people that were left sort of moved south and joined the Piscataway Indians on the Chesapeake Bay in southern Maryland. DC became DC. So it was throughout the kind of earlier 18th century, it was plantations, and specifically tobacco plantations, turning over to wheat farming a little bit later. So that's what was in DC. These are all these things here. DC became DC in the 1790s. You might know that is anyone here from Philadelphia? All right, well, you probably know anyway that the first capital is Philadelphia. Lawmakers met in Independence Hall. But what happened is in 1783, a crowd of, and this sounds familiar, 400 soldiers from the Continental Army mutinied because they had not been paid for their service during the Revolution. So they stormed Independence Hall and they blocked legislators for leaving. So our first kind of confrontation. Lawmakers got really spooked by this, and they decided that they wanted their own federal district that they thought would be safer. So that's what the genesis for this idea of DC as a purpose-built city was. They created a law, they passed a law in 1790 creating DC, and they sent George Washington to find a site. The one that he chose was conveniently near his own plantation, Mount Vernon, but also strategically located near the water. And there are already two existing towns, trading towns there. So Georgetown, which was once a separate city, and Alexandria, Virginia. I'm not going to go into much more detail about this, but the thing that I want to underscore is that DC is unique in that it's a purpose-built city. In many ways, it was defined by its visitors from its very beginning. So what happens is DC is established in 1800. There are a few people who are already there, but people start kind of moving in. First lawmakers, but then other people kind of around the apparatus of governance start coming to Washington. The very first sources that I am working with are from this period, from 1800 to the 1820s. So these first days of Washington, but also the first days of America. I would describe these as kind of anthropological accounts of the city by people who are curious about the new government, or foreigners who are curious about the new nation. I can't emphasize, and I'm not an 18th centuryist. I'm learning to be in various ways, but I can't emphasize enough kind of how weird all of this seems for, like, oh, the city that we have that's for government. Oh, a country that's doing democracy. Like there's a way in which the first visitors of DC are just kind of like anthropological. They want to figure it out. They're curious. All of these different accounts, they portray Washington and its people as both kind of strange and new, an experiment in governance, after all, also worthy of observation, kind of like democracy itself. So if you look in these books, or these different accounts, it's minutia. It's like the measurement of buildings, what kind of fish can be found in the Potomac, what people wear, what kind of parties they have, like what kind of hats they wear in the summer, how they say hello to each other in the streets. A lot of them are also really critical. So a lot of the newcomers and visitors do not like DC at first. We have letters from people like Abigail Adams and John Cotton Smith, who was one of the first congressmen. They complaining about it because it's just in the process of being built. They're like, there's no buildings here. There's no infrastructure. It's muddy. The weather is bad. Foreigners, especially the English, make fun of it. So there's a variety of sort of these satirical accounts from early English visitors that are like, look at this city. This is ridiculous. But, so these are interesting to read, to say the least. They're useful for setting the terms of inquiry about the city, specifically this kind of sense of strangeness on one hand and containedness that I think continues to hang around. They also give us an account of what visitors actually do when they get there, which is like riding around and seeing stuff, and going to parties and meeting people and observing government. But their authors are also from a really narrow demographic, right? They're wealthy enough to be able to afford to travel. They're uniformly white, well-connected. And they also self-select as memoirists. Like, they're people who have something to say about Washington, D.C. because they want to have something to say about Washington, D.C. So they tend to have strong opinions. So you have to take them with a grain of salt. You also start having these kind of more narratives, or diaries by people who are traveling to learn about the functions of the nation. So you have people who are kind of coming specifically to observe, but you also have people who are coming for, an entire winter. And a winter in Washington is when Congress is in session. So this happens more and more with expansion into the 1820s and 1830s of travel and lodging. So as soon as you have more ways to get around, you have more places to stay, and it kind of continued through the era of Jacksonian democracy. So you get these accounts from like more middle upper class Americans who come to the city, tour public buildings, go see speeches in Congress, and then write about it. So it's not as much like, look at this weird new thing. It's more, this is what I learned about our government by my winter in Washington. So you also start getting a new set of sources. So these are the first guidebooks of DC. They're sold in hotels and bookshops. They also contain a lot of information, the history of the founding of DC, discussion of how government works, congressional directory, detailed descriptions of every office building inside and out, including information about the artists and the artisans who worked on the Capitol, costs and measurements. They have also, for the first time, images. So lithographic plates show off some of the sites and look at people and show off people looking at sites kind of interestingly and importantly too. I think the way that these guides, along with the kind of narratives that are happening at the same time, are positioning the city and its visitors is a shift. They are descriptive, but they're also didactic. They're offering up the city as a place to see and learn about governance. By the 1840s, the guides have multiplied and they have even more illustrations, including more and more reproductions of the art in the capital elsewhere, like both the capital and elsewhere in Washington, D.C., and often maps of who sits where in Congress. So this is what you have on the right side here. It's this like very, very detailed map from a guide of, when you're going and watching Congress in session, this is who you're seeing. This is also because going and watching speeches is one of the main things that visitors are doing in the city at this point. This is also the age of the orator. So Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun, like these people are all nationally known names and they play to the crowd, right? So you go, you watch, and you hope that they're going to give a speech. So working with these early guides has been interesting but challenging. So again, I'm by training a 20th century person. I'm not an early 19th century person, so I've had to do a lot of reading into the early history of publishing and authorship and circulation. There's a lot of these guides. They're all, if you're curious, they're also a really lovely thing I've discovered about being an 18th centuryist and a 19th centuryist is copyright stuff. These are all freely available and digitized on places like archive.org and HathiTrust, so you can go look at them yourself too very easily. They're really similar. The scope of information and images, their perspective are all, there's different editions by different people, but they're more or less identical. So this indicates to me that there's kind of an emerging accord about the city as well as a stabilizing iconography, right? One of the questions that I still continue to ask, though, is how are these used? So the majority, and this is something that the archives don't tell you, the majority were printed and sold in DC, but they could also be bought in other cities. So occasionally you have advertisements for booksellers in New York or in Philadelphia or Boston. The specificity of practical information suggests that the primary users were people on site, but these kind of plates and detailed descriptions indicate that maybe the books were also for those either anticipating or reflecting upon a visit. I also wonder if they're for people who did not or could not visit as well, but wanted to learn about the city, specifically how it looked. So if you see registers for lending libraries in places like Philadelphia or Boston, it had these guides in them. So they were at least like tentatively available to people to just go and take a look at, right? But what's striking to me is what you would learn if you were reading one of these guides, specifically how it looks, how its built environment in art and sculpture reflects ideas about the nation, and a kind of awareness that looking at all of this stuff is connected to civic education and good citizenship. The accord across sources and also the way that Washington starts appearing in other texts at this time also suggests this. So there's also another type of source that I want to talk about from this period, which is that DC becomes the focus of abolitionist efforts precisely because of this combination of its emerging status as a symbol and a site of democracy, but also as a site of enslavement on the other. So Washington is a slave trading city. It's a waypoint between North and South. It has a significant enslaved population. It has a significant free black population as well. In 1841, Solomon Northrop is kidnapped from there. So if you've seen the movie or you know about 12 Years a Slave, so his account from 1853 of his kidnapping, but this was in Washington, D.C. He went down and this is where he was kidnapped. Descriptions and images of coffles of enslaved people in front of the Capitol and the White House. And there was a pretty notorious market right where the National Archives are now. So this is actually happening on Pennsylvania Avenue. But this kind of as a symbol, and you see this in the far right side, start appearing in abolitionist literature. The slave trade in DC becomes a huge point of debate because abolitionists make it so. It ends up being outlawed as part of the 1850 Compromise in the years leading up to the Civil War. It's largely a hollow victory because Alexandria, Virginia, which is just across the river, remains the center of the slave trade. But the thing that's significant here is the degree to which Washington kind of becomes a node in this larger set of compromises. So during the antebellum period, both symbolically and materially, DC is very much part of this kind of larger conversation about rights and representation. When the Civil War comes, Washington becomes the nerve center of the Union, not only governance and military, but also hospitals and other relief and aid efforts. So people flood into the city to help, but also to self-liberate. So many formerly enslaved people from the Confederacy and border states in the Union come up to Washington, D.C. We have in this era a lot of kind of different types of documentation by visitors. So there's a lot of accounts by people who come to volunteer in the city, including Louisa May Alcott and Walt Whitman, both who serve and work in hospitals in Washington, D.C. There's also work by Matthew Brady, the Civil War photographer who had a studio on Pennsylvania Avenue. Their accounts together capture a lot of the chaotic feelings of the city, but also specifically its built environment and its rapidly expanding built environment. So both Whitman and Alcott write in these accounts about wandering around Washington. Brady takes a lot of photographs. So some of our earliest photographs of Washington, D.C. streets come from Matthew Brady. So here, too, we start getting a tone shift. These accounts kind of stop being observatory at a distance. Instead, visitors more and more are seeking to join the city and its efforts. So the relationship to me seems to be a little bit closer. In the decades after the war, all of this continues and intensifies. So more and more people are moving to the city, most notably formerly enslaved people from Maryland and Virginia. The built environment in the city also expands. There's new residential neighborhoods, especially near some of the Civil War forts that had been built around the perimeter of the city. But the downtown and the kind of federal place, the federal area, grows during this period too. So immediately after, during the Civil War, the government starts growing. And after the Civil War, the government grows more and more. So you have new elected officials from new Western states, but you also have new departments and offices to oversee the growth and increasingly the administration of the nation. So the state is growing kind of at a rapid pace during this moment. People kind of encounter the government in different ways. So you have all these new buildings coming up from the 1870s to the 1890s. They also all pretty much look the same. So there's the massive State, War, and Navy building, what we now call the Old Executive Building. We have the Post Office Pavilion, which until recently was the Trump Hotel, and now is just like a regular Waldorf. We have the Pension Building, which is now the Building Museum. There's also the Library of Congress and the first buildings of the Smithsonian. So more and more, you just have these kind of large, giant federal buildings coming up. People are coming to the city to work as federal appointees and also to work in these departments. So you can see how big these buildings are. There are a lot of people that need to fill these offices, right? So on one hand, you have more and more government employees. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But you also kind of have people who come to work with the government or work on the government in different ways. So you get lobbyists or people collecting claims or pensions in the Civil War. So a lot of the iconography of Washington during this period is actually what I find really interesting. If you've ever seen how people are writing about and drawing political cartoons about capitalism during this moment, like lots of octopi, lots of spiders, lots of spider webs, lots of fat cats, this is how people these are all about DC, but this is just like how people are processing the growth of government. So you have Uncle Sam getting sort of physically bigger. You have all these special interests looming above Congress. You have all these webs of the law. I think it's interesting the degree to which these kind of two things are connected. The other way that people are kind of learning about the work of government, which is slightly less sensationalistic, is through all these accounts of the new government workers. So more and more people, women and men, black and white, are coming to DC to become clerks or to work in or around government in some other capacity. So a clerk at this point is a kind of catch-all phrase for any kind of administrative worker in business, but also applied to government again. So you see a little bit of continuity there. There are a lot of newspaper articles and books coming out at this moment detailing the works and lives of Washington clerks. Especially people are really, really obsessed with these women who work at the Treasury Department. And this is, I think, because this is new. Like, women working in offices is new. Women working for the government is new. They're well-paying, stable jobs. The work can be monotonous and physically tiring because a lot of the stuff that they're doing is physical labor. They are making the money. They are working the presses. They are sorting things. So in that way, it's sort of like factory work too. Sometimes the description of clerical work in the government or images published in books and other accounts kind of remind me of depictions of factory work. So if you've ever read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, that's just like chapter after chapter about different parts of the factory and how many people are in it and how hard it is on them. You get a sense of that from some of these accounts as well, and there's a lot of them. So you have these like written descriptions of at 4 p.m. when all the clerks get out of work and they stream out of the office buildings. And there's a ton of these. There are multiple accounts of work in government written by Washington correspondents, written by journalists, in memoirs by clerks themselves. And there's a huge audience for these accounts because people are interested in Washington. They're interested in Washington as a symbol of the kind of like the nation, the union that persevered, but also as the state expands, like the work that these clerks are doing is more likely to be connected to people's everyday lives. Prior to this moment, most people, you can live an entire life and not really encounter the state all that much. That is in the process of changing. So because people are using money, they're being taxed, they're looking for benefits, their food is being regulated, their work is being regulated, they're reading about it in newspapers. So people are interested in governance in a different way. This is what I think the abundance of these kind of accounts, but also the sort of the audience for it says. I consider this period from the 1880s to the early 1900s to be like the beginning of the modern coming to Washington story and experience in a lot of ways. But instead of observing from a distance, Americans are actually coming to Washington to interact with and to join the government. Proximity and access become important in ways that were not before. And so this is evident in the kind of explosion of cultural artifacts we have from this period. So on one hand, we have all of these accounts of what the work of government looks like. We have all these physical representations of government. We have these representations of the new built environment of government. But we also have like a million novels about people who are coming to Washington, literally a million, also all available on HathiTrust or archive.org and like 500 pages long and many, many similar things. So by the 1880s and the 1890s, America has a shared consumer culture, and with it, it has a reading public that extends across, in many ways, class, race, and religion, and region. So newspapers and magazines are cheap, so are novels. Because of rail transportation and mail order, it means that all of these are easily accessible. They kind of circulate in ways that literature didn't circulate in before. So there's just like literally dozens of novels and stories about people coming to Washington. This is also kind of what I mean when I said before about specific mediums and genres flaring up. There's always books about Washington or coming to Washington, but these kind of seem to all come up at once, be identical to each other in really specific ways, and they have a new significance. Like by the 1950s, no one cares about books about people coming to Washington, even though there are some. But they care about movies. But in the 1880s, 1890s, everyone cares about these. So they all follow a really similar trajectory. So like a man or a woman comes to the city in order to take part in some way in governance as an elected official or a lobbyist or a journalist. They go to So usually when they come into the city, the first thing they see is the Capitol, and they are enraptured by its wondrousness. They go to official receptions, they meet statesmen and diplomats. What happens really quickly is they get in over their heads, and they're quickly caught up in scandal. And the scandal can be either personal or political. Oftentimes it's both personal and political. And what that usually results from is that because they don't understand how things work. The big reveal in the book is like this person messed up because they don't know how things are in Washington, either legislatively or socially. Usually they get bailed out at the end, but like sometimes they have to leave the city. In a couple of occasions, they just die. But what this tells me is people really want to hear about this. People really want to hear this, but they're also really worried about what will happen to them. That on one hand, going to Washington is like really, really exciting, but if you don't watch out, then it'll burn you. So another type of book that suddenly becomes extremely prominent to the reading public are these full length etiquette guides. So this theme of coming to Washington and not knowing how to interact with it is so prevalent that you get this new text. You get this book-length guide to exactly how to comport yourself in Washington, D.C., like what to wear, how to address different people, how to invite yourself to people's homes. So this reflects the sense that Washington is an idiosyncratic place. So even going back to those very first accounts that were just like, this is a weird place, this is what people are doing, this is still happening. These books, I think, reflect the anxieties of all of these newcomers and visitors. And it's, like again, it's not clear who's using them, but they get reviewed in newspapers. They still exist in people's collections, so there must be a market for them. I think that part of the reason people want to read about visiting DC was because they themselves were visiting DC. So, like, one of the reasons you have all of these books and all these etiquette guides is, on one hand, because more people are encountering governance and curious about it, but also more people are coming to DC. Like, you have trains, you have less expensive hotels. By the late 19th century, tourism in the middle and upper classes, so Black and white, are becoming more and more common. So much and much more people are coming to Washington, D.C. By the late 19th century, guides have a lot of the same information, but they're less didactic than their 1850s, 1840s predecessors. So they're less like, go see this and you will learn about this. But they're more about access. So they have pictures, they have advertisements. They're printed as cheap paperbacks and sold all over the country. So there's just like, if there were a lot of them in the 1840s, there's like lots and lots and lots and lots of them by the 1870s and the 1880s. So the guides, and they're all, very similar. The guides that I look at, they always have visitation hours for every public building, but they also list hotels and churches like where different famous statesmen could be found living or dining or worshiping. So they tell people how to go to Center Market, which is the kind of central market in which senators and cabinet members might do their own shopping there. So a lot of this guide is like as much about what to see about DC, but also who you see in DC. Which is, again, a really, really interesting shift, and I think reflects this desire for access and this desire for a closer relationship. Victorians are sort of very voluminous diary keepers, so we have a decent amount of documentation of some of these trips, at least for middle and upper class people. That's who's keeping diaries. That's when they do something, if anyone here is like a 19th century person, there's tons and tons of diaries. They're people, they do something, they write it down. From these accounts, we know that many people who visited Washington also read novels about it. So in a lot of cases, you have people writing about, on one hand, going to go see the Library of Congress in the day, and then in the evening going back to the hotel and reading a book of one of these fictional books about going to DC. We also know that they use guidebooks to navigate the city. So we know from these diaries that tourists followed these directions pretty closely. So Elizabeth Smith, who came with her family, so I'll talk to you a little bit. I don't have images of them because it's just like pages of handwriting that is really difficult to read, but these are from archival accounts that are held in collections that I've looked at. So Elizabeth Smith came with her family in the late 1880s. So she goes to a different church every Sunday to look for celebrities. And then she writes down who she sees there. And if she doesn't see someone, she says, maybe I'll try again. Mary Church, who becomes Mary Church Terrell, comes from Ohio when she's in college and is thrilled to be introduced to Frederick Douglass in the street. So she's visiting family friends, and they see Frederick Douglass, and it's all she can write about in her diary because he was living there too. Postcards sent home by tourists also sometimes note when a famous person is sighted at the location. So they'll say, we went to the Department of State, War, and Navy, and I saw the senator, and he was shorter in real life. Another thing that people did is they collected souvenirs. I think souvenirs also reflect a kind of desire for lasting proximity, but people also don't limit themselves to what they can buy. So in the Victorian era, this like search for relics, people are kind of obsessed with material culture, which I'm sure all of you know probably better than I do in various ways. And a big problem develops in DC where tourists are lifting anything that isn't nailed down as a kind of souvenir. So this includes flowers from Arthur Washington's rose bush at Mount Vernon, which are supposed to be lucky for lovers, knickknacks from the White House, even pieces of buildings. So there's this kind of crumbly stone that's inside the Washington Monument, which has just been built, and they have a real problem because people are just taking it. So they end up having to close it for a while. So there's kind of like during this period, both the desire for access and proximity, but also an enactment of access and proximity that I think is new. To give the most vivid example of the ease of access that 19th century tourists had and demanded, Charles Guiteau, does anyone know who he is? All right, good. So Charles Guiteau is an office seeker. He comes to Washington to get a job with the James Garfield administration in 1881. Over the next course of a few weeks, and a lot of people were doing this. So this idea, this office seeker, this person that comes to Washington D.C. hoping to get a job from the kind of like newly elected administration is very, very so. So Guiteau is in a lot of ways one of hundreds. So he comes to D.C. He's hoping to get a job. He stays at a boarding house. Over the course of the next few weeks, he goes to the White House and hangs around Garfield's offices, which you could do at that point. You could walk into that White House and you could just hang out and hope that the president came by. He stole stationery. Nobody could stop him from doing it. They just kept on, he would go and he would steal stationery and they would sort of yell at him and he would just come back the next day. He managed to get to a reception, so official receptions are open. That's one of the things that are listed in newspapers and in guides. And he buttonholed multiple cabinet members in the street or in the lobbies of offices. He went to a reception and he met Mrs. Garfield. He kind of came up to her and he was like, your husband knows me a job. I made him president. So he was really trying. He saw Garfield with his family at church. He saw him walking in the street with James D. Blaine, who was the Secretary of State. As he grew more frustrated, he decided to assassinate Garfield. And so what he did is he bought a gun and he went down to the train station where Garfield was waiting to take a train to his vacation home. And he was just waiting in the waiting room, the president. And there, Guiteau shot the president at point blank. So yeah, the reason I asked you if you know who he is if you were a 19th century person, you would know that he was like a Lee Harvey Oswald of the 1900s or the 1880s. So he was at that time a very, very famous person. We know all of this because, like other Victorian visitors to Washington, he made a record of his experience. So he told his story to a journalist who published it as Guiteau's Confession, and it became yet another bestseller about Washington, D.C. And this is the thing. A lot of the aspects of his D.C. trip, going around to all the public buildings, interacting with political celebrities, even trying to get a job, are extremely typical of the period. His narrative is actually not that, except for the end, not that dissimilar to those of other travelers that I've been looking at. He's following a script in a really similar way. So for this reason, there's a lot of kind of use to reading these accounts, but a lot of challenges as well. Letters and accounts tend to be formulaic, so white middle-class visitors to DC, the main people who are keeping diaries that are accessible to researchers, they keep very close to the scripts provided by these guidebooks. So at times, they emulate the tone, so if you're reading theirs, there's sometimes pages and pages explaining in detail like what's on the doors of the Capitol or what's in every exhibit at the Smithsonian. Other ephemera is likewise formulaic. Visitors are collecting postcard views, but they all look the same. They send the same kind of postcards, and after the advent of personal photography, they pose for really similar looking photographs. So it's hard for me as a researcher to read between the lines there. But then as now, I think there's kind of something about visiting DC that encourages this kind of behavior. A great deal of tourist behavior is scripted, but this seems supercharged in DC, and I'm still theorizing about what that means. So something that I think you've noticed is that all of this comes across as visual representation. This is the moment that images of DC and images of people in DC start widely circulating. So as snapshots in magazine articles and postcards and views. And this is the way that visitors interact with. And it begins to solidify. So a pattern is set, circulated, and followed. So again, here are some more. These are illustrations from the early 20th century of tourists in DC. There's also these kind of tourist jokes that start circulating in the media. So this is also not only the Washington media, so in national papers. So in these jokes, the tourist is always kind of like the dupe. They're confused, or they're ignorant, or they're not paying attention, possibly because they don't have to, because they're simply going through the motions. To me, it's significant that this is a national discourse, that any newspaper reader is kind of expected to know the terms of the joke, even though they're quite specific to the experiences of Washington, D.C. There's kind of the sort of primacy of visual in DC has other implications, or the other cultures surrounding it as well. So DC is one of the very first locales for the new newsreels. So inauguration parades, already heavily featured in magazines and newspapers, are among the first on-location films to appear in kinetoscope parlors. The first ones are made in 1897, and we soon get lots of fictional films about Washington, D.C. as well. So a lot of those fictional films are lost. The newsreels aren't, but all of these films are films that we only have records of the description from film catalogs. But you can tell from the descriptions that a lot of what they're doing is they're repeating tourist jokes. So the Hazy's experience at the Washington Monument. And a lot of them also have really similar narratives from some of the kind of Washington, D.C. novels. So I haven't been able to see any of these, but it's striking to me the degree to which that they kind of they adhere to the narrative. So all of this is to say is that by the end of the 19th century, the built environment of DC, the Mall, Pennsylvania Avenue, in front of the White House and the Capitol, has kind of become a backdrop for demonstration of democratic participation, often in visual terms. So from these like inauguration parades to individuals posing with them. So it's not surprising that as coming to Washington starts to stand in for civic participation, Americans also feel that they could and should not only join, but also change governance. So you have activists starting to come to Washington and to stage protests and actions that both reflect and help to generate these kind of emerging visual tropes. So the three earliest marches on Washington are in 1894, 1913, and 1922. So they are respectively an industrial army of unemployed workers led by Jacob Coxey, the Women's Suffrage Parade organized by Alice Paul, and a silent march against lynching organized by the NAACP and local Black leaders that include Mary Church Terrell, who by this time has moved to Washington, D.C. and is kind of extremely active in local in activism for the next 50 or so years. So all three of these are reported by the national media, so we have significant documentation and text and image. But they're also organized for the national media. That is, they're in Washington not only because the government is in Washington, because the press is in Washington. And the sort of backdrops for demonstrating governance are in Washington too. They all have banners, costumes, marching in formation. And as the historian Lucy Barber has demonstrated, they set precedents for almost like a century of marches and actions to follow. So this is the picket of women's suffrage activists in front of the White House in 1817, 1818. I'm struck by this new movement as kind of in the larger trajectory that I'm building. So there's a significant shift once again. If early 19th century visitors are coming to observe and late 19th century visitors are coming to join starting in the 20th century and kind of throughout, people are coming to Washington to change the nation, and also more and more the city. And these come to be connected in ways that persevere even now. So I'm going to spend a little less time giving kind of extensive historical background because I think the broad strokes are likely more familiar to all of us, but I'm also happy to go back and elaborate in Q&A. But what I want to say is that we have by the 20th century across mediums, genres, actions, and concerns, a broad selection of cultural artifacts that kind of reflect these convictions, right? So we have Mr. Smith Goes to Washington as perhaps the most well-known of these kind of new films that emerge by the 1920s, 1930s about people coming to Washington, D.C. to change the nation. But it's like literally one of dozens. And they all have, again, fairly similar plot lines. An outsider comes to Washington, D.C. and makes a difference. The difference, too, and this is striking, is when compared to the novels that I was telling you about, the plot of those novels is usually like outsider gets eaten alive because they don't understand DC, whereas these are very much outsider comes to DC and just like changes everything, wins everyone over. By the way, this is Mr. Swiss Toast Washington is like one of these films, but you can see there's lots of other ideas of people coming to Washington too throughout the 20th century. We see what Mr. Smith Washington Goes to Washington reflects. I think it's a New Deal movie. It reflects kind of what New Dealers are doing. That you have just like tons and tons of young idealistic people coming to Washington, D.C. for many of the same reasons. From news stories and from memoirs, you see thousands of people coming to the city. Again, unlike their predecessors, they don't need an etiquette guide. They're not really worried about learning Washington etiquette. They're just excited to make a difference. And they very much create a new culture. So by the 1930s, and again, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is sort of part of this. There's a specific form of New Deal sociality. You have these kind of people who are idealistic, have expertise, kind of doing all this stuff together around the city. We see too activism that radiates from the city outwards and also from outside towards the city. So most notably in the 1930s and the 1940s, civil rights activists in the city and the nation are calling attention to segregation in Washington. Although in segregation, this is important to remember, DC kind of went through Reconstruction before the rest of the country went to Reconstruction, but was fairly integrated and actually had government representation until the 1870s, through the 1880s. By the 1890s, segregation sort of started to harden and continued to harden into the 20th century. So you have in the 1930s and the 1940s, activists and the nation are kind of calling attention to the segregation. So you have a long and significant resistance by Black Washingtonians. So Black Washingtonians are picketing places in the 1930s, trying to integrate places in the 1930s. But it's this kind of added involvement of newcomers. So first, New Deal workers like William Hastie and Annie Stein, Howard students like Pauline Murray and Walter Washington, they help bring momentum to ongoing struggles for equality. So one thing that's really interesting, when you look at everyone who's involved in kind of early civil rights actions in DC, it's always a mix of Washingtonians and then people from outside who have kind of just come to DC and said, I don't like this and I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to make clear too, I'm skipping over a ton of history, but I'm happy to talk about any of this more in Q&A. So this is a page from a 1948 report issued by the National Committee on Segregation in the nation's capital. And this was created by the Rosenwald Fund, and so Marshall Field's kind of charity or non-for-profit, and organized at the University of Chicago, so emphatically not in DC. If you look at this whole thing, it's really thorough in the ways that it catalogs. So this is just a page from it, the problem of segregation in DC. But this is one of the very first images of the book. So notice how it underscores the contradictions of the idea of DC for everyone and its treatment of Black visitors. So at times this book kind of even reads like a tour guide. It has this whole kind of interval where it imagines, they're like, what if Benjamin Banneker came back to Washington, D.C.? Like, would he be able to get a hotel room? I want to call your attention to, so what I want to call your attention to is the wording here. It's your capital. So this idea that DC is for everyone, everyone should have a stake in the city, this is a fairly new formulation at this moment, but it'll get stronger in time. So the historian Kate Mazur and others have called DC an example for all the land. So DC has kind of always been in various ways a laboratory for governance that started with Reconstruction and continues now. So it shouldn't be surprising to hear, for example, that Bowling versus Sharp, which is the precedent case for Brown versus Board of Ed, concerned a DC school. But also that segregation in DC ends in 1953. It ends because of efforts like this. It ends because of sustained effort, pickets by Mary Church Terrell, who is at this point in her 80s, but she is still out there picketing. So before it ends in the rest of the nation. But it's also a place where people kind of continue to claim their rights nationwide. So throughout the 20th century, people continue to look to DC and to come to DC. So studying this too, my work as a cultural historian has kind of shifted. If you look at 18th century stuff, you're playing history detective, right? When you're a 20th century historian, after the advent of mass culture, your task is to sort through everything and find the kind of most significant pieces, and then think too about what the subtle shifts are between these pieces. So by and large, so this is just a compendium of marches. So this is the Women's March, the March on Washington, the March against the Vietnam War, and the Million Man March. So you have kind of multiple, you see by and large people, whether they're activists, tourists, or office holders, like coming to DC and also following scripts, right? The Lonely Crusader, the Righteous Protesters, the Family on the Whirlwind Trip. Part of what I hope I've been able to show you today is the way that kind of these scripts replicate themselves and also where they originated, and continue to evidence themselves through various cultural artifacts, even as new scripts themselves informed by changing political and cultural contexts continue to emerge. So I want to finish by telling you what I think is kind of the most recent script or stage to coming to Washington and where I think that I see evidence of it. So if we've moved from 1800 on, from observe to join to change, I think we're closer to something called Occupy. So this is, by the way, this is Resurrection City. This is the Poor People's Campaign effort in 1968, where they camped out on the mall. This was planned by Martin Luther King Jr., but he was assassinated before he could take part in this. So this is sort of the summer of 1968. So ever since the 1860s, in order to have an impact in Washington, which is to say an impact in governance, like you have to stay a while. It is no longer, even though people are still kind of coming and marching and then leaving, you have people who are coming and the staying is part of the sort of performance of the activism. So by the 1970s, even though we still have, again, these kind of more traditional marches, we have this shift in tactics. So even though protesters have, so Coxey's army, when they come in 1894, they stay outside of DC. So protesters have always kind of camped or stayed in the area, but the action is always the march. The action is now kind of also the occupation. So again, here's Resurrection City. Here is the American Indian Movement's take over the Bureau of Indian Affairs. This is Vietnam marches. This is the AIDS pill, which I think is kind of an interesting form of occupation in that it sort of like literally takes over the mall. And then this is Occupy DC in 2011. So in the same way, too, I think politicians and appointees tend to stay a while. So think tanks and lobbies come to DC in the 1970s and the 1980s, eventually creating what's called a revolving door between politics, policy, and journalism. So you literally have the same people moving in and out of government in ways that they were not before, whether they're elected or not. So this, I think, also gives a sort of rise to a particular political culture in DC. So this kind of Politico, West Wing's part of it, this town are part of it, right? So this is kind of where I think DC is now. And I want to end by where I began on January 6th, because I think one of the reasons I think it was so shocking, well, there are a lot of reasons why it was really shocking, is because it appeared to be an aberration. But what I want to argue is that it wasn't. It was built on 200 years of history. So throughout this talk, I've been telling you about categories of visitors, the tourist, the office holder, and the activist. But there's a fourth one in there too. So from the militia that barricaded Independence Hall in 1783 to the British who burned the White House in 1814 to the Union soldiers camping and convalescing during the Civil War to the World War I soldiers who start a rape riot in 1919, some of who come back in 1932 as part of the bonus army of veterans demanding early pensions. So there's kind of always militia coming to DC as well. So the January 6th insurrectionists are part of a larger set of militarized forces. So states and protesters had been in DC all summer. They're there because of the way that DC functions as this kind of symbolic site for participation. So this is taken at some point during the George Floyd protests of the summer of 2020. So you can see kind of there's already, and the military activity is striking. But I think you see more and more of this, and it's kind of worth paying attention to it as part of this larger system of occupation. If you ask me about the stakes of this project really quickly, and what I'm hoping that in the end, readers and audience will take away that the ideas and the expectations that we have about DC, about going to DC, are part of a larger trajectory of currents and ideas that are very much in flux. And they're made visible through this kind of comparative synthesis and analysis of a wide variety of sources. So I want to finish up, but I'm happy to go into methodology and approaches during Q&A, or if you're interested in hearing my thoughts about practice. I'm also happy to talk about kind of my developing public-facing plans of this project or fill in missing parts of what has been this very sort of bird's eye view of this image. So yeah, I'm thrilled to take questions. Thank you.